Good evening. My name is Linnea Shively, and I'm a freshman here at Hillsdale College intending to major in political economy and minor in journalism. It's an honor to introduce our speaker tonight. Christopher F. Rufo is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and founder and director of Battlefront, a public policy research center. Author of the recent Imprimis essay, Critical Race Theory, What It Is and How to Fight It, he is a graduate of Georgetown University and a former Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. As executive director at the Documentary Foundation, he has directed 4 films for PBS, including most recently America Lost, which explores life in Youngstown, Ohio, Memphis, Tennessee, and Stockton, California. He is also a contributing editor of City Journal, where he covers topics including critical race theory, homelessness, addiction, and crime. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Rufo.
All right. How's everyone? Good. Good to meet you. I think I see some of my students from this last week. I've been teaching a 1-credit journalism class. All of the students present will get an A in the class, so congratulations. Over there, well done. Well, let's see what we can do. Let's get in some trouble tonight, maybe. I know that this is being recorded and live streamed, so I'm hoping to say something interesting and noteworthy in the next 30 minutes or so. The topic tonight is laying siege to the institutions. And so the question is, what does that mean? But before we can answer that question, we have to know the context in which that question must be asked. And so I'd like us to take a step back to the period that none of you remember, you're all far too young, the period of 1968. If you look at 1968, it was really a turning point, a very kind of paradoxical and contradictory turning point in American history. You had then all of the left-wing ideologies that seem so dominant in our institutions today being born in the months in and around 1968. You had the birth of identity politics. You had the idea that the United States could be overthrown through cultural revolution. And then you had the very beginnings of militant street activists that had sought to, what they believed, use urban guerrilla warfare to achieve their political objectives. And I think many of the stories that I work on, many of the phenomena that we see, many of the public policies that some of our friends on the far left in places like Seattle or San Francisco or New York or Chicago are proposing, if you actually look back and look at the literature, look at the manifestos, look at the publications of that era, you see a remarkable similarity. It's almost as if we're living in permanent repeat of some of those ideas. The only difference, unfortunately, is that in 1968, it was also the year that was the election of Richard Nixon, not exactly a fire-breathing leftist. And so you saw this left-wing movement burn out over time. By the mid-1970s, the groups like the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, the Weather Underground, or their counterparts in Europe, in Germany and Italy and other countries that had sought to really capitalize on what they saw as a world historical change in 1968, had met really a sad and divided end. They were infiltrated by law enforcement. Their campaign for urban guerrilla warfare generated discontent, especially in the communities that they claimed to represent. And so by the end of it, there was just a few dozen angry, disillusioned, demoralized radicals. The FBI had swept up many of them. And what you sense in the literature and the history of the time, and you could read it in all of the journalistic work, the letters, the essays, some of the academic work, is that they realized that this moment had been lost. They looked at it as the victory of counter-revolutionary forces, embodied most prominently in the United States by Richard Nixon. But really, at the heart of it, the lesson that they learned at the time was that the working class in the West, in Western Europe, and most especially in the United States, could not be roused to revolution. That class-based idea that you could have the suppressed workers or the oppressed workers rise up against their bosses in the factories in places like Detroit, Michigan, was doomed. And in fact, working class Americans were not only non-revolutionary, they were anti-revolutionary. They were actually satisfied with a rapidly rising standard of living, with benefits and privileges that their parents and grandparents could not have even imagined, perhaps when they were immigrating from Europe in the decades prior. And so this immense frustration by the time you hit the 1970s is really evident at all of the work of the period. And so they settled on a strategy of the long march through the institutions. They realized that they couldn't set off bombs in the US Capitol as they tried to do, or assassinate police officers, shooting them in the back of the head at point-blank range in New York City, as they had done a number of times. But they actually formulated a new, more sophisticated, and frankly very successful strategy of abandoning hope that the lumpen proletariat, so the outcasts of society, people who were truly the downtrodden and forgotten remnants of the American class system, they really abandoned hope that they could be part of this revolution. They said, we're going to go a revolution of the intelligentsia, a revolution of elites, by seizing control of not of the means of production. You'd be hard-pressed to get some academics running a factory line in Detroit, but through the means of culture and knowledge production. And so what you see is these washed-up radicals in the 60s, 70s, really, 80s, migrating into academia. And then migrating, bringing their ideas, for example, in the 1970s, out of the radical manifestos, the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary manifestos, and into formalized academic work. What I've done, we're going to fast forward, we have a little bit limited amount of time, but what I've done in the last 2 years is report on the state of our institutions today. I've looked at the federal government, I've looked at the universities, I've looked at Fortune 100 companies, and I've looked at K-12 schools. And what I found is something that I think is shocking to most Americans. You're taking the core concepts that were developed in that period after 1968. They've been sanitized, adapted, repackaged, and repurposed, and then injected into American life at the lateral, bureaucratic, and institutional level. So you have an idea that seems somewhat frivolous, maybe somewhat ridiculous, like white privilege, that's being taught in many stories that I've reported on to kids as young as 7, 8, 9 years old, that children in a classroom can be separated into oppressor and oppressed based on identity categories, based on skin color, and then deemed oppressor and oppressed. And then the kids in the public classroom, let's say in Cupertino, California, they recently did this for third graders, should atone for their white privilege. Some of it seems a little goofy, it seems a little bit ridiculous, but the origins of white privilege theory, again, were from 1968. It was a Marxist-Leninist theory. The idea is that you'd have to break down working class notions of white privilege in order for them to join the Marxist revolution. And so the purpose and the origins of a lot of these ideas, as you go down the line, all emerges from that point and now has been transferred through academic literature, through K-12 pedagogy, through masters in education programs, through K-12 curriculum modules, through HR programs, human resources departments at corporations. And I think what we find ourselves in is a maze of postmodern language that is the other element that is grafted onto the revolutionary rhetoric of 60, 70 years ago now. And it's a language of obfuscation, it's a language of euphemism, and it's a language of demoralization. And so as many of you have been following, for example, the fight against critical race theory, one of the fights that has been really going on for a year, almost to the point of absurdity, is this euphemistic game of, well, what is critical race theory? That's not critical race theory. Critical race theory is an obscure legal theory only found in upper division law school classes. Oh, well, your K through 12 elementary curriculum says critical race theory on the cover. It's using all the principles of critical race theory. That couldn't be. It couldn't exist. That's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so you get these ideas that are wrapped in language that is meant to obscure or meant to be impenetrable or unopposable. I think none of us, very few people, certainly in the United States and to a lesser extent, but also in the world, would oppose diversity in the true sense of the word, meaning having a variety of experiences, interacting with a different variety of people. This is why Americans travel. This is why you go overseas. You want to get a diversity of perspective and culture, opinion, history. That's not what it means in practice, though. The next term, equality, or equity, rather, it appeals to this idea that's a homonym with equality, and yet the significance of it is the exact opposite. Equality is the idea that each individual should be protected under the law, regardless of characteristics that might be grouping them into that might be separating them into different groups or categories. This idea that no matter who you are, where you come from, you'll be treated equally under the law. Equity takes the opposite view. It would replace the system of individual rights with a system of group identity-based rights. And that your merit or your worth or your position or the material resources that are divided and then distributed should be based not on your individual potential or character or work or accomplishment, but based on your group identity that takes no account of your individual characteristics or excellence. And so what I've tried to do in my reporting is to surface all of these very dense and very euphemistic phrases and terms that you're probably seeing popping up everywhere. You're probably seeing it at work. You might be seeing it in your kids' K through 12 school curriculum. You're certainly seeing it in the political sphere. And our federal government is absolutely saturated with it. And it's trying to make heads or tails. It's trying to make sense of this language. It's trying to get to the heart of what these words mean. Because I think that only then you can truly have a sense of how you can defeat it, how you can fight back. Because what I've seen over and over in my reporting, looking at original source documents, is that every elite institution in the country that has dominance over knowledge, dominance over culture, dominance over even, in many cases, material production, has converged on a unitary ideology. It's really a remarkable thing. The HR training program at Walmart, for example, is the same as the 5th grade education module in Buffalo Public Schools, is the same as the diversity and inclusion training program at the Department of the Treasury in Washington, D.C. All three have examples from my reporting. And it's a very kind of basic list of concepts, derived in this case from critical race theory, that says the United States is fundamentally and irredeemably a racist country. The country today is saturated through with systemic racism. In the racial categorization of citizens in the here and now, it can be divided on the axis of oppressor and oppressed based on race. And people who are deemed white or, in some cases, white enough, like Asian Americans, strangely, you have to atone for your privilege. You have to bankrupt your privilege. And then if you want to be reaccepted back into society after that process, you have to submit to the political ideology that regards not freedom and equality, not the Constitution, not the principle of equal protection, not even the system of individual rights, but moving to a system of collective group-based rights, moving to a system that is explicitly anti-capitalist. You have organizations, for example, like American Express, preaching that capitalism is fundamentally racist. American Express, teaching that capitalism is fundamentally racist. And so on and so forth. And one of the great curiosities for me was, how is this even possible? I'm sorting through documents from 5,000 different sources, all over the country, from every kind of institution, from all walks of life. How is it possible that it's been distilled down to these key, say, 7 to 10 ideas that are then implanted into the organizations through the bureaucracy? So it's either the DEI bureaucracy, that's kind of the most common one now. Human resources is another one. There's all sorts of different euphemisms that get constantly created and recreated. But the ideology is the same, and the ideology is really indistinguishable at its essence from a lot of those materials that we saw in 1968. And so the question is, what can we do to fight back? I'm going to talk about tactics, and then I'm going to talk about strategy. As far as tactics, I've been tasked and asked to talk a little bit about a story that I broke last week while I was teaching the journalism students here at Hillsdale College about a company called Walt Disney. So any news watchers in the room? Yeah, okay. So you've probably heard about this scandal, really, with the Walt Disney Company. I've actually been reporting on Walt Disney for more than a year, off and on. I have some good sources inside the company. I broke a story last year that Walt Disney Company was forcing employees to engage in a critical race theory training program, which denounced the United States as a fundamentally racist country, asked its white employees to complete a white privilege checklist, and then advocated for all of the fashionable causes. I believe they had exercises in there to decolonize your bookshelf, whatever that means, and any kind of these pedagogical techniques or kind of fashionable self-reflection exercises that you see in all of these corporations. Disney was doing it. After I broke the story, Disney's first attempt was to deflect. They sent out this amazing press release, actually. They said, because people were criticizing, they said, this is racist. You're dividing your employees along the basis of race. They've created racially segregated employee groups, employee activist groups. They're denouncing the country. They're denouncing a large part of their employees and their customers on the basis of skin color. And Disney said in a press release, no, we can't be racist. We made the movie Black Panther, which is a kind of bizarre corporate variation on the old joke about, I can't be racist, I have black friends. It was really a kind of ridiculous moment where they were caught, you could see between the lines of the press release, totally off guard. Because in the elite milieu, this is something that is not even questioned. In fact, the Disney employees who leaked me these documents and then the video said, you cannot question it. You can't say a word. You have to be silent. This is the new orthodoxy. It's the orthodoxy in every elite institution. If you want to keep your job, you have to shut up. Disney eventually deleted their entire program from their internal website. So a big victory for me. That's always fun. But of course, these things get deleted temporarily, but they always resurface. Because it's not that it was well-intentioned people, that they made a mistake, or they had a document in their server or part of their training program that they didn't agree with. These things are baked into the bureaucracy. And so last week I was sent a series of, I was sent actually the full video, an hour and 40 minutes approximately, of Disney's internal meetings regarding its very political and very public fight with the governor of Florida, a man named Ron DeSantis, who signed a bill, I think very simple bill, that simply said you have to keep education on gender ideology, sexual orientation, and sexuality out of the classroom between the ages of kindergarten and third grade. This seems fairly common sense. I think it has, depending on the polling questions, somewhere between 60 and 80% support, an overwhelming number of Americans. But the activist groups within Disney were furious because they believe that Disney, as the world's largest entertainment corporation, certainly the largest entertainment corporation in human history regarding kids' entertainment, they believed that they were the moral voice on children and sexuality, and that they wanted to not only oppose the legislation, but use all of the levers of corporate power to fundamentally reshape the narrative about kids and sexuality. And so I released a series of videos last week that had, for example, an executive producer saying that she was deliberately, with the support of her colleagues, inserting what she called a, quote, not-so-secret gay agenda into kids' programming, targeting kids as young as 2 years old. Another Disney employee, a production coordinator, said that he had created a tracking program to make sure that the company was including enough transgender, non-binary, and asexual characters. I think I have those terms right. And this whole series of statements, which you might imagine happening at maybe the Women's Studies Department at Vassar College, but I think rightly concerned a lot of people when it was high-level executives saying we are going to fundamentally change the relationship between kids and sexuality in the United States by reshaping, by engineering a narrative based on gender ideology. We're going to do so really secretly. They didn't make an announcement about this. While at the same time, we're going to be publicly opposing any legislation that would provide a restriction on this in public schools. And so this was, in short, I think, a scandal for Disney. They were very tough. They were kind of chest-beating executives, had gone out prior to this story, saying what they were going to do, talking trash to the governor, committing to overthrowing this bill and overturning it. And then after they were really pummeled, I think Fox News mentioned this story 300 times in 24 hours at one point last week. The New York Times wrote about it. They said this was all fine until Chris Rufo got a hold of it. Tried to blame me for it. And then the company went fairly silent. I think it probably also has something to do with those poll numbers we talked about, where a huge majority of not just Florida voters, but American voters, American adults, said, hey, wait a minute, this is too much. We don't want to have gender ideology being taken from the university and being forced on kindergartners behind the backs of parents without informing them about what's going on. And this is something we've seen over and over and over, whether it's critical race theory or gender ideology. And so I think we've struck quite a blow. Disney was trending on Twitter, which is, I think, a kind of a distorted approximation for what's in the news in some ways, for an entire week. You had conservatives boycotting, canceling Disney subscriptions. Anyone cancel a Disney subscription in the last week? Okay, good. That's at least $500 a month or whatever. You had a lot of people canceling, and I think you had a lot of Americans really raising questions. What's happening with our institutions? What's happening with kids? I also discovered that, playing a bit of hardball, when a company enters the political debate on the issues of children and sexuality, my argument was that, well, we should actually examine their record on children and sexuality. And to my somewhat surprise, I found out that the Walt Disney Company has had a notorious pattern, at least once a year for the last decade, and then before that as well, of having employees arrested for child sex crimes, child pornography, child exploitation, child rape, etc. And not only that, that's obviously bad enough. It appears from the coverage that it is a disproportionate number. The Polk County Sheriff, who's adjacent to Disney's operations in Orlando, Florida, it seems like every time he does a sex sting, he nabs at least a few Disney employees. Disproportionate, I would imagine, based on the limited evidence, to their rate in the labor force. And so my point is that when a company is claiming the moral high ground on these issues of children and sexuality, we should look at their record And of course, they're not responsible for everything their employees do on their own time. But I also found a few stories as well. Disney, for example, Disney authorities allegedly told their cruise ship security guard to keep her mouth shut when she discovered that one of the Disney employees was molesting a young boy on the cruise ship, which allowed him to evade arrest. And then Disney flew him back home to India, so he couldn't stand to be accountable. And also, the Disney's Cruise Ship Lobbyist Association, the trade association, of which Disney is a member, had advocated against, had opposed, and then significantly watered down legislation that would have required Disney and other cruise lines to report sexual abuse on its cruise ships in a timely and stringent manner. And so I think the lesson of this is that the institutions in the United States that have adopted these ideologies cannot be appeased. They can't be easily shifted from within. They've been captured at the bureaucratic level, and Disney has the perfect case study. Disney executives have delegated moral authority within the company and political authority within the company to internal activist organizations, whether they're in the race and sex segregated identity caucuses or in the human resources departments. And so what it's going to require is not a long march through the institutions. I think most conservatives don't have the ambition of one day being a diversity and equity director at a public school district, whatever that might look like. So the strategy is not to say, well, let's march back in. Let's have a kind of counter march. I think the strategy is quite different. It's an actual siege strategy. It's from the outside, and it's taking on our superior public support. Because whether it's critical race theory or gender ideology in schools, for example, we have about a 2-to-1 margin, the public supporting our position and opposing the position of the institutions. These institutions don't choose these ideologies democratically. You didn't vote for it. I didn't vote for it. They're imposed anti-democratically by fiat through bureaucratic, not democratic rule. And so what we're seeing, I think, as the first step is a narrative and symbolic war against companies like Disney, for one example. You have to be very aggressive. You have to fight on terms that you define. You have to create your own frame, your own language. And you have to be ruthless and brutal in pursuit of something good. The second strategy is mobilizing popular support. We're seeing this at school board level. After the reporting that I did and some other colleagues had then picked up on about critical race theory in public schools, I saw this amazing emergence organically of irate parents coming home from work, tired in their dress clothes, showing up at those school board meetings and giving hell to those school board officials. Did you see any of these videos? Yeah. And we know for a fact that these parents didn't know what was happening in the classroom. They never voted or approved of this. And when they found out what was happening, they were livid. And so parents are getting mobilized on that grassroots level to oppose this kind of ideological capture in those K through 12 school districts. And when they won't listen, which is much of the time, parents who have organized and run campaigns are winning overwhelming elections. We're talking 70-30. If you put your name on the ballot in the median school districts in the United States, and you say, I'm the anti-critical race theory candidate, I'm going to get our education system back to the basics of reading, writing, math, etc., prioritizing excellence over ideology, you're going to win in many places at that 70-30 level. I think reflecting overwhelming public support. And I think the third step then is to decentralize. Because a lot of these problems emerge because of centralization, because of bureaucratic rule, because of control by a minority of permanently publicly subsidized activists that have turned public institutions into private ideological organizations. And I think when you look at schools as another good example, we can talk about universities maybe if we have a little time, But when you talk about schools, there's no reason that if you're a parent, you don't have the means, let's say, to send your kid to private school or parochial school, that you should be stuck in a public school based on your zip code, that violates your child's right to conscience, that shames or demoralizes your child on the basis of race or identity, and that you're allowed no recourse through the bureaucracy and no escape mechanism. There's no reason why we can't have, for example, universal school choice, so that a family that says, you know what, this isn't for me, this violates our family's values at a deep level, shouldn't be able to take that average of $15,000 a year and move it wherever they want. It could be another public school, it could be a charter school, it could be a private school. This is controversial, I don't know why, but could also be to a religious school. Because what's happening is that you have 90% of public school of American school children attending public schools. You have 90% of American university students attending public universities. You have a monopoly that unless it's broken up, unless parents are given more power, more freedom, more options, more choice, they're going to be forced to run their kids through a gauntlet that they can't control. And so I think if you categorize them all together, to summarize very briefly, you're engaging in a narrative war. I mentioned earlier that there's this kind of postmodern layering on top of all of our institutions to turn the, let's say, revolutionary ideology into something very gauzy, very vague, very seductive, very attractive, soft language. We have to rip that veil off of really what's happening and show Americans through reporting, through information, through investigation, through public records requests, et cetera, exactly what's happening. And we have to fight at that narrative and symbolic level. We live in an information society. And if we are unilaterally outmanned on that front, it's impossible to gain traction. Someone could go to the school board meeting and literally not have the words to oppose what's happening. And so that's what I've tried to do, what others are now also doing, is providing people a kind of key into explaining beyond the euphemism exactly what's happening, what those words mean, ripping the cover off of that language, and providing them with a renewed moral language to be waging the fight, not within the confines of the opposition's framing, but by creating a new frame. And so with critical race theory, for example, it creates an entirely new frame. You're fighting substantively, accurately, but also with language that you can point to. You can go to a school board meeting, you can explain, and you can oppose. And the evidence shows, from polling data that's been done kind of sequentially over the last 18 months, 18 months ago, let's say 2 years ago, round up, 0% of the American people knew about critical race theory. In the last 18 months, we've brought that number up to 75% of the American people. And we've turned it into a 2-to-1 issue, which in politics, I don't know, many of you are in politics. If you go to, say, let's say a campaign manager and you say, hey, we have a 2-to-1 issue. I mean, they're going to be salivating and drooling and, calling in ad buys immediately. That's a decisive victory in a otherwise fairly evenly divided society. The second is to attack the credibility of institutions. This is something that I think conservatives have been rightly hesitant to do for many years. Well, we like our institutions. I think conservatives are really realizing now we like what our institutions were, we like what we imagined them to be, and now that we are seeing what they are, we don't like them as much. And so, luckily, the institutions are really doing this to themselves. You see trust in all of our institutions cratering. I think it's foolhardy to say, well, we really want to just raise that number. I think you want to create the conditions for fundamental structural change, to appropriate some language. For example, school choice. To get universal school choice, You really need to operate from a premise of universal public school distrust. Because in order for people to take significant action, they have to feel like they have something at stake. I think that the public schools have done a remarkable job at doing that, specifically the public school teachers' unions. They shut down schools for more than a year. In some districts, half of all kids never showed up to online learning. They've had the most catastrophic learning loss likely since World War II. They kept kids masked for years while the adults traveled around the world with no mask on. And the teachers' union endorsed promoting critical race theory in all 14,000 local school districts. And I think, finally, and the positive side of this, is we have to create alternatives. I think that in a dynamic society, like the society that we have, we also have the opportunity and the responsibility to create alternatives. And in many cases, I think many of us have, and many parents, for example, I include myself in this for a while, not anymore, got complacent. Well, you know, kind of send my kids to school, should be fine, kind of like what I had growing up. And I just don't think that that's a realistic option for people anymore. And when I talk to parents, for example, all over the country, they're desperate for new ideas, new options. You have now 5 million American kids in homeschool. There's just been an explosion in homeschooling. You have even the Hillsdale charter schools that are now expanding. Parents are desperate for intellectual entrepreneurship, in a sense, political entrepreneurship. Rather than just simply fighting about who gets what, actually creating something substantive that matches people's values. And so, before we take questions, I'd just like to close by repeating the stakes, by resetting the stakes, rather. I really think that the key dynamic for us to all be thinking about is not necessarily even a left versus right dynamic. It is that's important, but I think where the opportunity lies is really a top and bottom dynamic. So a kind of elite class that represents a very small amount of people that has positions of influence within the kind of knowledge-making institutions, within pedagogical institutions, that has designed and implemented and distributed all of these ideas that we're finding in the reporting, and the vast majority of the American people who are still attached to the idea that America is a force for good, that their kids should be protected from radical ideologies being imposed on them in the tender ages of elementary school, for example, and that our country, in some ways, has gone off the rails. And they want a sense of security. They want a sense that people are fighting for them. And I really think there's a common intuition of all of the good that can still be raised into our institutions, raised into our country. Maybe not in the exact way that it looks now, but in the way that it could be. And so I really think it's up to all of us. You could be maybe on offense. There's some of us, I think me included, that really are just built for offense. And there's some that are built for creating institutions, for playing defense, for protecting the civilizational values and virtues that should be continued from the past into the future. And I think that if we are just taking these two poles, these two systems, these two worldviews, we really have an option between the revolution of 1776 or the revolution of 1968. And I think one of them offers a method for this incredible unfolding of those founding principles of freedom and equality, and the other one ends up in nihilism and despair and demoralization. It ends up in a bombed out bunker in Greenwich Village in the 1970s. And so I would suggest to you, even some of you who may not be temperamentally predisposed, that the best strategy in the immediate term is the siege of the institutions, and that we should prepare for the fight. Thank you so much. Questions?
Thank you, Mr. Rufo. We will now have time for some questions. If you have a brief question, please make your way to a microphone.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your talk, Chris.
Sure.
I want to touch on something that you said here in your talk about narrative warfare. One of the biggest problems I think we face right now is social media censorship. So, you broke this story about Disney on Twitter. And obviously you have a lot of clout there, and the story can spread like wildfire. And that's obviously a weapon that the left can use, is to simply silence those voices they don't like. And so in some ways it feels that the position in the narrative war is very fragile. What are some of the ways that you think we as conservatives can get around the very obvious opposition we face from big tech? One of the thoughts that I've had is that attacks on the monopoly status of many of these firms is absolutely necessary to ensure that we have the platform to be able to spread the message like critical race theory. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Great question. I think that the Disney story is a perfect example of a potential answer, or at least a suggestion of answer. One of the things that I personally like about the governor of Florida, and I've been able to actually work with his team on policy on some of these issues, is that he's not unwilling, to stand up to big companies, even the big companies in his state. I think he recognizes that our corporations should ultimately be serving the common good, should be serving the country. And he understands also that the political power is ultimately higher than business power. And through the legislature, we can set the rules of the game. If there's anti-censorship legislation, I think there's some common sense regulation that could happen to protect people, accepting that the digital communications infrastructure is the new public square, or the digital public square. And I think you also wield power, for example, against a company like Disney. If Disney is actively undermining the families and voters of say, Florida, I know that I've been looking into it, and Governor DeSantis has been looking into it, and Congressman Jim Banks, for example, from nearby in Indiana, is looking into it. Well, let's see if we can level the playing field a little bit. Disney gets massive tax breaks from Florida. Legislators are looking into those. The Congress has extended Disney's copyright, essentially doing their bidding in perpetuity, multiple times longer than what the founders had intended in their 28-year copyright limit. And Republicans, including Jim Banks, have said clearly, when Disney's copyrights on things like Mickey Mouse expire next year, and they come hat in hand to Congress saying, you better extend it, conservatives are going to say, no, we're not going to extend it. We're going to allow those things to go into the public domain. And so I think you can, in some ways, remind companies that the deal that corporate executives thought that they had in the last few years is we've already won with conservatives. We've bought them off. We have low tax rates. We have competitive economic environment. It's better to be a big corporation than a sole proprietor or a small business in the United States. And so we've bought them off on economic issues. We bought off the right. And so we're going to buy off the left on culture issues. And they're finding out that relationship can shift and the power can change. And so I'm optimistic. Then you have wild cards like Elon Musk. I don't know anything about him personally. I never met him, but I think there's just a feeling right now that we can tap into to maybe channel that Teddy Roosevelt spirit, where we want to have free enterprise, we want to have free competition, but what we don't want to have is cartel organizations, kind of ideological and economic cartels, dictating the terms from up high down to the average person. And so I'm optimistic about all that.
Hi, thank you for coming, and I appreciate what you said. I can't wait to revisit it online. But my wife and I moved up here in 2013 to put our kids in Hillsdale Academy to get them out of the public school system. So I appreciate that. We did what we needed to do there, and we did cancel our Disney account this past week. I've been needing a reason to do it. It's been itching, but that's not what I wanted to ask you. I despise the term racism because I believe we're one race, right? There's different counts of melanin in a person's skin, but we're one race, and I despise that term because it breeds division.
Mm-hmm.
And what would you say, how can we overcome that particular term? One of the beauties of America's tapestry is that we come from so many diverse ethnicities and tribes and nations and tongues, but we're one nation. And what would you suggest?
I would suggest that people, the vast majority of people agree with you in the sense that we are one nation. We come from all over the planet. I mean, really unique, a unique composition of people. And that we want to have narratives and especially pedagogies that inspire kids, that help kids transcend maybe their differences, aiming them towards excellence, aiming them towards their greatest accomplishments. And, you know, as you look at the public polling data, it's very clear. The Manhattan Institute released polling data from America's 20 fastest growing cities. These are places that are very diverse, a lot of young families, people trying to move their way up the ladder, live the American dream. And the numbers were quite clear among parents. Parents opposed lessons on critical race theory, systemic racism, and white privilege by, I believe, a 42% margin. Overwhelming. And this includes a majority of parents who are white, black, Latino, Asian, so a majority of every racial demographic. And they want to have an education that says, that speaks to them, the values of all of these everyday people. They said, look, I just want to have my kid have a chance to come up in the world, to do better than I could do, to get a great job, to raise a great family. And these are kind of the humble but universal building blocks that I see people tapping into every day. And they sense that it's going to be crushed by these people who occupy positions of enormous power and privilege that simply have this kind of poisonous and nihilistic ideology, wherever it comes from, whatever its lineage is, that they want to impose from the top down. And so I think the best way to overcome it is not to be a Pollyanna. You have to acknowledge the historical existence of racism in the United States, for example, but always put it in the context of the country's highest ideals and the country's steady progress towards realizing them. And I think it's a unifying message, and wherever I go, people I talk to from all different backgrounds, you know, as long as you're not, you know, at the New York Times building or something, it's something that they want and they need, and we have to be unafraid to talk about it.
Chris, thank you for your thoughts. One of the things that bothers me is the total chaos in the country. I mean, I wouldn't trust the FDA, the CDC. For sure, the FBI is equivalent to the Gestapo, and maybe the CIA. The military, I don't know if they're for fighting a war or fighting gender wars. What do you think about what's going on in society beyond critical race theory? It seems to be a total meltdown of trust in any of the institutions on any of the issues, be they science or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is pretty simple. There's been a rupture in trust because a lot of the institutions have been untrustworthy. That's the simple fact. I don't think that people have the trust numbers have plummeted because our institutions have been so wise and virtuous and fantastic that, and we're just the ungrateful kind of plebes, you know, below. I mean, look at COVID. It's, you know, in a lot of cases, this is not my area of expertise, but from just a personal point of view, all of these things that were conspiracy theories, so-called conspiracy theories by, you know, the science in capital letters, turned out to be true. You know, whether it's the lab leak or whether it's, well, you can't get COVID if you have the vaccine, or you can't pass it along, or we need to have endless masking. It's the most effective plan. I mean, you look at the politics that has been embedded in all these institutions, and then you look at the decisions. I think I saw, you know, the most heartbreaking numbers, for example, of businesses that collapsed in the COVID lockdowns. Those are people's life savings, their livelihood, their whole dream, the whole thing they've worked towards. You have teenagers that lost out on their high school experience. You have skyrocketing rates of depression and suicide among kids. And then you turn around as parents are trying to say, I'm trying to keep a job, I'm trying to keep my business afloat, I'm trying to make sure my kid doesn't sink into the abyss. I'm being lectured on television, and then I drop into my kid's third grade social studies class, and he's being lectured on critical race theory. It's a very simple response to people's everyday experience, I think. And it's too bad. It's awful. But I don't think that, I've kind of learned this maybe the hard way, but these problems aren't going to be solved by asking very nicely and politely for the people in positions of power to pretty please do a better job. And you know what else is something true, related? You know, something, I'll share an experience from Disney. You know, the other thing that we need to stop doing is allowing or is limiting our arguments to things that are deemed appropriate by liberals. In journalism, you wouldn't believe, the kind of self-censorship. Talk about, the biggest crisis is self-censorship. It's not even getting banned from social media. In the sense that, well, you know, I wrote the story about, hey, what is Disney's actual record on child sex crimes? Let's be honest about it. You can't say that. That's just absolutely horrible. Yeah, that's out of bounds. No, it's not. And I think if we internalize, and this is, you know, depends on how online you are, but there's a kind of a classical liberal or a centrist liberal or a kind of like a Bill Maher type. Appealing to people in that category will get you nowhere. And do you want to try to get the kind of plaudits or the approval of people in that circle, in the kind of left liberal media environment and follow their kind of rules of discourse and debate and language? Or do you want to actually align with the 60% of people who are fighting for their companies, fighting for their jobs, fighting for their kids, that are represented by legislators at the state level and the federal level that are actually going to get the job done? And too many people in my world, in my field of journalism, they choose the former, and I like to think that in 15, 20, 30 years, they're going to realize, wow, I was really polite this whole time, but I didn't achieve anything. And so I'd rather be impolite. I'd rather get in a little bit of trouble. I'd rather make some of the, you know, prominent people a little angry and actually deliver results. And so I think we're doing that with Disney. I think the story, for example, with these videos, it generated at a bare minimum 150 million media impressions. You know, I think that it's almost certain now that Republicans in Congress will not extend their copyrights next year when they expire. That's a multi-billion-dollar hit to Disney. And you're not going to get that done by being really polite and following all the rules. I hate to say it. Sorry, kids. I hope to, you know, but be polite at Hillsdale to your teachers and your administrators. But out there, you know, toughen up. Right here.
How much influence, or mainly the 1619 project that's been an influence on CRT?
Okay, question, 1619 project. I've said this a number of times. The 1619 project is an epiphenomenon It is a ephemeral creation that people are going to forget about in a probably a relatively short to medium period of time. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to get too worked up about it. I think that it can displace a lot of attention from the deeper issues about the ideology, where it comes from, how it works bureaucratically. And I'm personally not too worried about the 1619 project. In the sense, I'm not saying it's good, I don't like it, but in the sense that I don't think that the 1619 project is like is going to do grave damage. I think that we have to really keep our eye focused at a much deeper level. And the question is, how do you blow up the transmission belt that delivers the 1619 project to millions of school kids? And if you blow up the transmission belt, the New York Times is going to be stuck with a lot of copies of the 1619 project, you know?
We have time for one more question.
All right, great.
This question is about blowing up the transmission belt. Thank you for all you do for opening our eyes. KSOL, the social emotional learning company that K through 12 schools look to for their social emotional learning, they are now promoting equity with excellence in education. How do we crank out more non-woke teachers from our woke universities and still be able to label them as excellence when the academic world says, oh, our public universities are excellent, you know, we have to have certified. How do we, do we have a way to do that?
Great question, and we do. There's a couple of ways. I'll talk about maybe the most effective way. Look, a lot of this, I know Michigan's kind of a purple state. Purple state, would you consider it? Yeah, okay. But even red states, I talk to people in red states, how do we deal with this horrible problem of our public university system? I don't know, you're the state legislature. You pay for it, you pass appropriations bills for it, it's under your jurisdiction, and every year you just write a blank check to the public university system. These are public universities that should reflect and transmit the values of the public, and the representatives of the public, i.e. state legislators, have ultimate power to shape or reshape those institutions. And so we have to get out of this idea that somehow public university system is a totally independent entity that practices academic freedom. A total fraud. That's just a false statement, fundamentally false. And that you can't touch it or else you're impinging on the rights of you know, the gender studies department to follow their dreams, you know? I mean, it really is that simple. And legislators, you talk to them, they're like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Because it's such in the background of our experience. We accept it as a given. We accept it as the status quo that we can't even examine. But I think legislators are starting, in Florida they're doing it, in Texas they're doing it. They're starting to say, hey, wait a minute. Why is every taxi driver, short order cook, and plumber in my state paying six-figure salaries for a diversity and inclusion department at a public university, where these folks are making $300,000, $400,000 a year, and you look at their job description, it's undiscernible what they do. I mean, you're funding private political activism with public dollars. So states can say, no more public dollars for that. You can take it away. I think another thing that states can do and should do is saying, well, we're going to actually open a new branch of our public university system. Let's say the flagship, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Conservatives, let's say, have both houses in the governorship in Michigan, for example. A policy you could pursue would be to say, we're going to have an independent board of directors appointed by the governor, and we're going to have a conservative center that is independently governed within the University of Michigan or the University of Texas. And then you create a magnet for conservative professors. You create a bit of debate within the university. You create a variety of perspectives. You create a diversity of courses. And you're creating a separate patronage system Some people don't like thinking about it that way, but guess what? The public universities, the DEI departments, the public school bureaucracies are at the end of the day patronage systems for left-wing activists. And as long as there's going to be a patronage system, wouldn't it be good to have some people who are representing the public within them? I think the answer is probably yes. And then for teachers specifically, there's absolutely no reason that teachers need a master's degree to teach reading to third graders. And in fact, all of the academic studies, which are by no means right-leaning or conservative, they show that teacher credentialing and teachers' master's programs have zero relationship with quality teaching in the classroom. And in fact, many people, education scholars, whom I trust, say that it actually does significant damage to the public school workforce because you have the craziest people in charge of departments of education. I mean, really, truly. The #1 most assigned textbook for master or graduate level departments of education is a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. He was a Brazilian Marxist-Leninist whose greatest claim to fame was running the educational propaganda for the Marxist-Leninist governments in West Africa after decolonization. And he very famously ran the education program for Guinea-Bissau, the West African nation. And some scholars went back years later, and he was heralded as this genius of education, bringing education to the countryside, educating the peasants. Paulo Freire is teaching everyone to read. They actually studied the results. They couldn't find a single example of a single person that learned basic literacy under his programs. And guess what? American public school students are doing better than the public school students in Guinea-Bissau, for sure. But you still have about 1/4 of them never achieve basic literacy, despite education spending doubling or more in the last generation or 2 generations. And so the simple answer is say, from the state level, pass legislation, there's no financial benefit and there's no requirement for teachers to get advanced educational credentials, degrees, masters, et cetera. And you can have someone who's, say, a history major at Hillsdale College that is excited, wants to learn how to teach, can get a job teaching history at a public school. There's no reason that you couldn't have a system as simple as that. And what that does is it cuts out this cartel, essentially. You have to pass through the Graduate School of Education cartel. If you want your piece of paper in order to teach, you have to go through their thing. So they have a captured customer, a captured line of business. Get rid of it. Say no more statewide. If you want to go, you can go, spend your own money. It's not required, and guess what? I think nobody would go. Truly, I really feel like maybe some, lunatics would go, and that's fine. But then you'd look at them and say, the ones with don't hire the ones with the masters, because those are the crazies. So I think a lot of it is, look, public policy is the greatest tool that we have. Almost all of our problems are created by public policy. Almost all of the worst ideologues in our society are permanently subsidized by public dollars. And so we need to have the courage and the intelligence and the tenacity to say, what the public giveth, the public can taketh away. And so we get in there, we defund things we don't like, we fund things we do like, and we try to break up the system so that ultimately we're taking power away from those centralized authorities and giving it back to everyday people. Because I spend a lot of time at both parts of our society, in the kind of fancy parts and in the kind of everyday parts. And at the end of the day, I would trust people in the middle and that big bottom, making sane and rational and wise decisions. And so the more we can put power into their hands, the better we're going to be. So I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for coming out.
Thanks again, Chris. For our guests, we have a hospitality just out here in the lobby. You're welcome. If you leave hungry, it's your own fault. So for students, go do your homework.